When a famous pianist told a 16-year-old blind black girl to play something simple at Chicago's most exclusive charity gala, he expected to humiliate her in front of the city's musical elite. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It destroyed his career and changed everything about how talent is recognized in America. Amara Johnson stood motionless beside the Steinway grand piano at the Steinway Cultural Hall, her white cane trembling in her hands as 200 of Chicago's wealthiest donors watched in uncomfortable silence. She had arrived with her Aunt Grace, who worked as a janitor at the Chicago Music Academy, and had somehow managed to secure 2 tickets to the season's most exclusive musical event. Richard Pemberton, at 42, the city's most celebrated pianist with sold-out world tours and million-dollar contracts, adjusted his designer tuxedo and smiled condescendingly at the audience of cultural elites. To him, this misplaced girl represented everything wrong with modern inclusion policies, a charity case disrupting serious musical culture. "Come on, don't be shy," he insisted, his voice dripping with practiced cruelty. "I'm sure our generous patrons would love to see how their diversity investments are paying off." Fursu, what none of them knew was that Amara had spent 8 hours a day for the past decade practicing on a borrowed keyboard in a church basement, memorizing not just every note of the world's greatest compositions, but every slight, every dismissive comment, every moment of underestimation she would use to fuel what was about to become the most devastating musical lesson the Chicago elite would ever receive. The crystal chandeliers of the Steinway Cultural Hall cast dancing shadows across the faces of Chicago's most influential music patrons. At $5,000 per ticket, the annual Chicago Music Foundation Gala represented the pinnacle of cultural sophistication, or so the 200 assembled guests believed as they sipped Dom Perignon and discussed their latest philanthropic investments. Caroline Mitchell, the foundation's director, nervously adjusted her pearl necklace as she surveyed the room. This event needed to raise $2. $3 million for the city's music education programs, and with Richard Pemberton as the featured performer, she was confident they'd exceed their goal. Richard commanded $150,000 per performance, but his reputation alone guaranteed the kind of wealthy attendance that made these numbers possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caroline announced, her voice carrying across the ornate hall, "tonight we celebrate not just musical excellence, but our commitment to fostering the next generation of artists in Chicago's most underserved communities." The polite applause that followed was interrupted by an unexpected sight. Near the side entrance, a young black girl stood with an older woman in a simple black dress. The girl carried a white cane and moved with the careful precision of someone navigating a world designed for the sighted. Amara Johnson, 16, had the kind of quiet dignity that made people notice her, even in a crowd of Chicago's elite. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her modest navy dress, borrowed from her aunt's closet, stood in stark contrast to the designer gowns surrounding her. But it was her posture that caught attention. Straight-backed, chin lifted, hands steady on her cane. She carried herself like someone who belonged, even though everything about the situation suggested she didn't. Grace Johnson, her aunt, squeezed her hand gently. "Remember what I told you," Grace whispered. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone tonight." But Amara's slight smile suggested she had other plans. For 8 years, since losing her sight in the car accident that claimed her parents, she had lived with Grace in a small apartment on Chicago's South Side. Grace worked double shifts as a janitor at the Chicago Music Academy, and through her access to the building's practice rooms and abandoned sheet music, Amara had discovered something that would change both their lives forever. What started as a way to process grief had evolved into something extraordinary. While other teenagers were discovering social media and dating, Amara was memorizing the complete works of Bach, Chopin, and Rachmaninoff. She didn't just learn the notes. She studied the historical context, the emotional undertones, the subtle interpretations that separated good pianists from great ones. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just another grieving girl finding solace in music. Tonight, she was about to encounter the man whose condescending interview about maintaining standards in classical music had gone viral 6 months earlier, an interview that had specifically dismissed what he called feel-good inclusion policies that prioritize diversity over excellence. Richard Pemberton emerged from the backstage area, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom tuxedo fitted to perfection. At 42, he commanded respect in rooms like this, not just for his technical mastery, but for his ability to make wealthy patrons feel sophisticated by association. He had built his career on the premise that classical music was an elite art form, and he saw himself as a guardian of that exclusivity. "Richard," called Elizabeth Whitmore, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune and the evening's primary sponsor. "I was just telling the Cromwells about your upcoming European tour. Simply marvelous." Richard's smile was practiced, charming, and completely empty of warmth. "Elizabeth, you're too kind, though I must say maintaining artistic standards while navigating today's political climate presents unique challenges." What he didn't know was that Amara had memorized every word of his interviews, every dismissive comment, every subtle suggestion that people like her didn't belong in spaces like this. And as she stood in the shadows, listening to his voice carry across the room, she made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. But what Richard couldn't see was that behind Amara's quiet exterior, 8 years of determination were about to collide with a lifetime of arrogance in the most public way possible. The evening's formal program began with Caroline Mitchell's carefully rehearsed speech about the transformative power of music education. Amara and Grace had found seats in the back section, where the lighting was dimmer and the attention less focused. From there, Amara could hear everything: the rustle of expensive fabric, the clink of champagne glasses, the murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes. "Our featured performer tonight needs no introduction," Caroline continued, her voice betraying the slightest tremor of nervousness. "Richard Pemberton has graced the world's most prestigious stages, from Carnegie Hall to the Vienna State Opera. His interpretation of Chopin's ballades has been called transcendent by the New York Times." The applause was thunderous, the kind reserved for celebrities in rooms full of people desperate to be associated with greatness. Richard approached the Steinway grand piano, a $180,000 instrument donated specifically for this event, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to be there. But as he adjusted the bench height and tested the keys, something unexpected happened. A small commotion near the back of the hall caught his attention. Security was speaking quietly to Grace Johnson, gesturing toward the exit. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but these seats are reserved for benefactors only," the security guard was saying, his voice low but carrying enough for nearby patrons to hear. "There seems to be some confusion with your tickets." Grace's face flushed with embarrassment. I work at the Chicago Music Academy. Mrs. Mitchell said employees could attend if there were available seats." The conversation was drawing stares. Elizabeth Whitmore leaned toward her companion, Dr. Jonathan Reed, conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. "How inappropriate," she whispered. "These events have protocols for a reason." Richard should have begun playing. The program was running late, and the audience was growing restless. But something about the scene unfolding captivated him, specifically the quiet girl with the white cane who seemed unaffected by the commotion around her. "Perhaps," Richard said, his voice carrying across the hall, "we should let our unexpected guests enjoy the evening. After all, music is supposed to be for everyone, isn't it?" His tone was theatrical, performative, designed to make him appear magnanimous while subtly highlighting the social awkwardness of the situation. The audience chuckled appreciatively, recognizing the masterful way he had turned a potential disruption into an opportunity to demonstrate his own graciousness. But Amara heard something else in his voice, the same condescending tone from his interviews, the subtle suggestion that people like her were acceptable only as objects of charity, never as equals. "Actually," Richard continued, warming to his theme, "why don't we make this interactive? Young lady," he gestured toward Amara, "since you're here to experience the transformative power of music, perhaps you'd like to try the piano yourself. I'm sure our generous donors would love to see how their investments in music education are paying off." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't part of the program, and the potential for embarrassment was enormous. Caroline Mitchell looked mortified. "Richard, I don't think that's—" "Nonsense," Richard interrupted, his confidence growing as he sensed the room's discomfort. "This is exactly the kind of moment our benefactors should witness. The intersection of privilege and opportunity, of talent and training. Come on, don't be shy." Grace reached for Amara's hand, ready to guide her toward the exit. But Amara's fingers tightened around her cane, and she turned her face toward the stage with an expression that made several observers pause. "What piece would you like me to play?" Amara asked, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent hall. The question caught Richard off guard. He had expected embarrassment, maybe a stammered excuse, certainly not this calm acceptance of his challenge. But he recovered quickly, his smile broadening as he sensed an opportunity to demonstrate the vast gulf between real talent and well-meaning inclusion. "Oh, anything you're comfortable with," he said, his patronizing tone now unmistakable. "Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? Or perhaps, Happy Birthday? I'm sure our audience would appreciate anything you can manage." The laughter that followed was polite but cruel, the kind that emerges when people feel superior to someone they perceive as less fortunate. Elizabeth Whitmore shook her head in barely concealed disgust. "Doctor." Reed looked uncomfortable but said nothing, but Amara's response silenced the room completely. "I was thinking more along the lines of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Though if you think that might be too challenging for this audience, I could start with something simpler." The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the air conditioning system humming in the background, because everyone in that room suddenly realized they were about to witness something far more significant than a simple musical demonstration. The Steinway Cultural Hall had hosted countless performances over its 50-year history, but nothing quite like the moment that was now unfolding. 200 of Chicago's most influential citizens sat in stunned silence as a blind 16-year-old girl proposed to perform one of classical music's most technically demanding pieces, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor wasn't just difficult, it was a piece that had humbled conservatory graduates and professional pianists. The technical requirements were staggering: rapid scale passages, complex polyrhythms, and emotional depth that typically came only with years of professional experience. For Richard Pemberton to suggest it was beyond his audience's sophistication was insulting. For a teenager to propose performing, it was either breathtaking confidence or devastating naivety. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice carrying a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Did you say the G minor ballade, young lady? That's a piece that requires years of intensive study. It's not something you can simply attempt." But Amara was already moving toward the stage, her white cane tapping against the marble floor with practiced precision. Grace started to follow, but something in her niece's posture stopped her. She had seen this look before, the same quiet determination Amara had shown when learning to navigate their apartment after losing her sight, the same focus she displayed during her endless practice sessions in the church basement. "Perhaps," Amara said, reaching the piano bench, "you could demonstrate the opening measures. I'd like to hear your interpretation before I begin." The request was delivered with such calm politeness that it took Richard a moment to recognize it as a challenge. Several patrons exchanged glances. "Doctor," Reed leaned forward in his chair, his conductor's instincts sensing something unusual in the girl's demeanor. "My interpretation," Richard repeated, his confidence wavering slightly. "Well, yes, of course. Though I should mention that this particular ballade requires not just technical skill, but emotional maturity. It's based on a Polish legend about a knight who must choose between love and duty. The musical narrative is quite complex." He was stalling, and everyone in the room could sense it. The Ballad No. 1 was indeed in Richard's repertoire, but it wasn't one of his strongest pieces. His interpretation, while technically proficient, had always been criticized by serious critics as lacking emotional depth. The Chicago Tribune had once described his version as note perfect but soul absent. "I'm familiar with the legend," Amara replied, settling onto the bench with surprising grace. "Adam Mickiewicz's ballad about the knight who lost everything because he couldn't recognize true love when it was offered to him. The music tells the story of someone who mistakes appearance for substance, doesn't it?" The literary reference stunned several patrons. Elizabeth Whitmore, who considered herself well-educated, had never heard of Mickiewicz. Dr. Reed's eyebrows raised in surprise. Most conservatory students couldn't articulate the ballad's narrative origins so clearly. Richard felt the first stirring of unease. This wasn't playing out as he had expected. "Yes, well, the literary connection is academic. The real challenge is in the execution. The piece requires tremendous physical strength, particularly in the climactic passages." "Physical strength," Amara repeated thoughtfully. Or perhaps emotional strength? I've always wondered whether the difficulty pianists experience with this piece comes from the technical demands or from the emotional honesty it requires. The comment hit Richard like a physical blow. It was precisely the criticism that had haunted his career, the suggestion that his playing, while technically impressive, lacked the emotional authenticity that separated good pianists from great ones. I think, Richard said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, that we should let the music speak for itself. If you're truly prepared to attempt this piece, then by all means, proceed. But I hope you understand that this isn't a practice room. These are serious music lovers who can distinguish between genuine artistry and, well, enthusiasm. What Richard didn't know was that Amara had spent 3 years specifically studying his interpretations. She had memorized every recording, every performance video, every interview where he discussed his approach to the romantic repertoire. She knew his strengths, his weaknesses, and most importantly, she knew exactly how to expose the hollow sophistication that had made him famous. "Before I begin," Amara said, her hands finding their position on the keys, "I'd like to ask the audience something. Has anyone here ever lost everything they loved in a single moment and had to rebuild their entire understanding of the world?" The question hung in the air like a suspended cord. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of question asked at charity galas, where suffering was discussed in the abstract and solutions were financial. Grace Johnson, sitting in the back row, felt tears prick her eyes. She remembered the 8-year-old girl who had awakened in a hospital bed to discover that her parents were gone and her sight was never coming back. She remembered the months of rage, the years of struggle, and finally the gradual transformation of that pain into something beautiful and purposeful. "The thing about losing everything," Amara continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "is that it teaches you the difference between what sounds impressive and what actually matters. Between technical perfection and emotional truth, between playing notes and making music." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Something in the girl's tone, in the way she held herself at the piano, suggested that the evening was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. "I learned this piece," Amara said, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Not from sheet music, but from pain. Every note represents something I lost, something I fought to regain, or something I discovered I never actually needed. When you hear it, you won't just be listening to Chopin. You'll be listening to what it sounds like when someone who has truly lost everything finds their way back to beauty." And as Amara's hands touched the first keys, everyone in that room realized they were about to discover the difference between a pianist who had studied suffering and one who had lived it. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor emerged from the Steinway with a clarity that made the entire hall hold its breath. But this wasn't the dramatic, performance-oriented opening that Richard Pemberton typically delivered. Instead, Amara began with something far more dangerous: genuine emotion. The opening melody, marked Largo, flowed from her fingers like a conversation with an old friend. Where Richard's interpretation had always been technically precise but emotionally distant, Amara's version carried the weight of lived experience. Each note seemed to emerge from a place of deep understanding, as if she weren't just playing Chopin's composition, but translating her own story into music. Dr. Jonathan Reed, conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, leaned forward in his chair. In his 30-year career, he had heard this piece performed by some of the world's greatest pianists. But something about this interpretation was different. The tempo was slightly slower than standard, but the pacing felt inevitable, as if the music were unfolding according to its own internal logic, rather than following a predetermined plan. "My God," he whispered to Elizabeth Whitmore, who sat beside him with her mouth slightly open. "She's not just playing the notes. She's telling the story." Richard Pemberton stood frozen beside the piano, his confidence evaporating as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. This wasn't a teenager attempting a piece beyond her capabilities. This was a musician who understood the composition in ways that had eluded him despite decades of study. The ballade's opening theme, which tells the story of a knight riding through a forest, emerged under Amara's hands with a sense of journey and purpose. But it was the subtle way she handled the transitions, the moments between the main themes where lesser pianists often faltered, that revealed her true mastery. Grace Johnson, watching from the back row, recognized the story her niece was telling. The opening theme wasn't just about a mythical knight. It was about an 8-year-old girl navigating a world that had suddenly become foreign and frightening. The music spoke of careful steps, of learning to trust touch and sound in place of sight, of discovering that darkness could be its own kind of illumination. As Amara moved into the piece's first development, the technical demands increased dramatically. The right hand carried a complex melody, while the left hand provided intricate accompaniment patterns that required absolute coordination. Most pianists approach this section with visible effort, their faces showing the concentration required to manage the competing demands. But Amara played with the effortless grace of someone for whom the music had become second nature. Her face remained calm, almost meditative, as her fingers navigated passages that had challenged conservatory graduates. The physical blindness that Richard had suggested would limit her performance seemed instead to enhance her connection to the music. Caroline Mitchell, the Foundation's director, felt a growing sense of panic. This wasn't what she had planned for the evening. The program was supposed to showcase Richard's artistry, not turn into an impromptu competition with a teenager. But she also couldn't deny what she was hearing. The girl was extraordinary. "How is this possible?" Elizabeth Whitmore whispered to Dr. Reed. "She's just a child from the South Side. How could she possibly have developed this level of sophistication?" "Doctor?" Reed shook his head, his expression one of wonder and growing excitement. "I don't know, but I intend to find out. This is the kind of raw talent that appears maybe once in a generation." The piece continued to unfold, and with each measure, Amara's mastery became more apparent. She wasn't just technically proficient, she was interpreting the music with a depth that suggested years of serious study. Her understanding of the composition's structure, its emotional architecture, its narrative flow, was sophisticated beyond her years. But it was when she reached the piece's famous middle section, the area where the knight encounters the woman who will become his obsession, that Amara revealed the true extent of her preparation. This section, marked by rapid arpeggios and complex harmonic progressions, was where most pianists either soared or stumbled. Amara soared. The arpeggios flowed like water, each note perfectly placed, perfectly timed, perfectly weighted. The harmonic progressions, which could sound academic in less skilled hands, told a story of seduction and danger, of beauty that concealed destruction. She played with the kind of interpretive insight that typically came only with professional experience and emotional maturity. Richard watched in growing horror as his own limitations were exposed by contrast. Every choice Amara made highlighted a corresponding weakness in his own interpretation. Where he had relied on technical display, she found emotional truth. Where he had imposed an external structure, she revealed the music's internal logic. The audience was transfixed. These were people who attended concerts regularly, who considered themselves sophisticated listeners. But they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just technical mastery, but the kind of musical communication that transforms performance into art. "She's been studying this piece for years, Doctor," Reed murmured, his voice filled with awe. "This isn't talent, this is dedication. This is someone who has lived with this music until it became part of her soul." As Amara approached the piece's climactic section, the tension in the room was palpable. The climax of the G minor ballad was notoriously difficult, requiring not just technical skill, but the kind of emotional commitment that few pianists could sustain. It was the moment where the knight realizes his mistake, where love and duty collide in a catastrophic finale. But Amara wasn't just approaching the climax, she was building toward it, with the kind of architectural understanding that suggested she saw the entire piece as a unified narrative. Every phrase, every dynamic change, every subtle rubato was leading toward this moment of revelation. And as the music built toward its devastating conclusion, everyone in that room realized they were about to witness not just a performance, but a complete dismantling of everything they thought they knew about talent, training, and the true meaning of musical genius. The climactic section of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 arrived like a thunderstorm that had been building throughout the evening. Amara's hands moved across the keys with breathtaking precision, each note contributing to a musical narrative that had transcended performance and become storytelling at its most profound level. The famous fortissimo passage, the moment where the knight realizes his devastating mistake, emerged from the Steinway with such emotional intensity that several patrons audibly gasped. This wasn't the controlled academic interpretation that Richard Pemberton had always delivered. This was raw, honest, and so deeply felt that it seemed to pull emotions from the audience they didn't know they possessed. Richard stood paralyzed beside the piano, watching his reputation crumble with each perfectly executed measure. The girl wasn't just playing the piece, she was improving upon interpretations he had spent decades developing. Every musical choice she made revealed depths in the composition that his own performances had never accessed. Dr. Jonathan Reed had tears streaming down his face, something he hadn't experienced during a musical performance in over 20 years. "This is what we've been missing," he whispered to Elizabeth Whitmore. "This is what music is supposed to be." The technical demands of the climax were staggering. Rapid octave passages in the left hand, complex melodic lines in the right, dynamic contrasts that required absolute control. It was the kind of challenge that separated professional pianists from amateurs. But Amara navigated these difficulties with an ease that suggested they weren't obstacles to be overcome, but natural expressions of the music's emotional content. Grace Johnson watched her niece with a mixture of pride and awe. She had witnessed thousands of hours of practice, had seen Amara struggle with every aspect of this piece, until she had internalized not just the notes, but the soul of the composition. But seeing it performed in front of Chicago's cultural elite was a validation she had never dared to hope for. "Where did she learn this?" Elizabeth Whitmore asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How is this possible?" The answer was visible in Amara's complete absorption in the music. She had learned it the way few people ever learned anything, through total immersion, through living with the composition until it became part of her identity. The basement practice sessions, the borrowed keyboard, the endless repetition had produced something that formal training alone could never achieve. As the piece moved toward its final pages, the emotional intensity continued to build. The knight's realization of his loss, his desperate attempt to reclaim what he had destroyed, his final acceptance of his fate, all of this was present in Amara's interpretation with a clarity that was almost unbearable. Caroline Mitchell realized that her carefully planned evening had been completely hijacked. This wasn't supposed to happen. Richard Pemberton was the star, the draw, the reason people had paid $5,000 per ticket. But the audience was completely captivated by the blind girl, who had somehow mastered one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. The final pages of the ballade arrived with devastating beauty. The knight's theme returned, but transformed by loss and understanding. Where the opening had been confident and purposeful, the conclusion was elegiac, tinged with the kind of wisdom that comes only through suffering. Amara played these final measures with such delicate control that the audience seemed to stop breathing. Every note was perfectly placed, perfectly weighted, perfectly expressive. The music spoke of acceptance, of the beauty that can emerge from destruction, of the peace that comes when someone stops fighting against their circumstances and instead finds meaning within them. And then, with a final whispered chord, it was over. The silence that followed was unlike anything the Steinway Cultural Hall had ever experienced. It wasn't the pause before applause. It was the silence of people who had been fundamentally changed by what they had witnessed. The music had ended, but its impact continued to resonate in the hearts and minds of everyone present. Richard Pemberton looked around the room with growing horror. Every face showed the same expression: wonder, awe, and the dawning realization that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. His own performance, scheduled to be the evening's highlight, now seemed impossible. How could anyone follow what they had just heard? Dr. Reed was the first to move, rising from his chair with the kind of reverence typically reserved for sacred occasions. "Brava," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Brava." The word seemed to break the spell. Suddenly the entire audience was on their feet, applauding with an intensity that shook the crystal chandeliers. This wasn't polite charity gala applause. This was the kind of ovation reserved for performances that redefined what was possible. But even as the applause thundered around her, Amara remained seated at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys. She had delivered her message, told her story, proved her point. The music had done what music was supposed to do. It had revealed truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the continuing applause. "That was what it sounds like when someone who has lost everything finds their way back to beauty. When someone who has been told they don't belong decides to belong anyway. When someone who has been underestimated decides to show the world what they're actually capable of." Suet, but as the ovation continued, everyone in that room realized that what they had just witnessed wasn't just a performance. It was a complete transformation of how they understood talent, determination, and the true meaning of musical genius. The applause seemed to last forever, but eventually it faded into a charged silence that left everyone in the Steinway Cultural Hall grappling with what they had just witnessed. Amara remained seated at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her expression calm but watchful. She had delivered her message, but the evening was far from over. Richard Pemberton stood frozen beside the piano, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and growing panic. His entire identity was built on being the most skilled pianist in any room, the acknowledged master, whose interpretations defined excellence. But a blind 16-year-old girl had just demonstrated that his decades of training, his prestigious degrees, his international recognition, meant nothing compared to genuine musical understanding. "That was—" Caroline Mitchell began, her voice trailing off as she struggled to find words. As the Foundation's director, she was supposed to manage these events, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this moment. "Extraordinary," Dr. Jonathan Reed finished, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of someone who had spent 30 years recognizing musical genius. "In my entire career, I've never heard that piece interpreted with such depth, such emotional honesty, such complete understanding of its narrative structure." The praise hit Richard like a physical blow. Dr. Reed was one of the most respected musical authorities in Chicago, someone whose opinion carried weight in conservatories and concert halls worldwide. To hear him praise a teenager's interpretation over his own was professional devastation. "Now wait just a minute," Richard said, his voice sharp with desperation. "That was certainly enthusiastic. But let's not get carried away. Technical proficiency and emotional manipulation are not the same thing as mature musical interpretation." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the ugliness beneath Richard's words. He was dismissing Amara's extraordinary performance as mere emotional manipulation, revealing more about his own limitations than hers. "Emotional manipulation?" Amara asked, turning slightly toward Richard's voice. "Is that what you call it when someone uses their own experience to connect with a composer's intentions? When someone finds truth in music, rather than just displaying technical skill?" The question was delivered with such quiet dignity that it made Richard's defensiveness seem petty and small. Elizabeth Whitmore, who had initially been skeptical of Amara's presence, found herself leaning forward, fascinated by the girl's composure under pressure. "I call it," Richard said, his voice taking on a cruel edge, "the difference between real musical education and whatever this is. You may have memorized the notes, but you clearly don't understand the historical context, the structural sophistication, the cultural significance of what you just attempted." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Amara's slight smile suggested she had been hoping for this moment. "Historical context," she repeated thoughtfully. "You mean like how Chopin composed this ballade during his relationship with George Sand, when he was grappling with his own exile from Poland? How the piece reflects his struggle between his Polish identity and his life in Paris? How the narrative structure mirrors Adam Mickiewicz's ballad about the knight who mistakes surface beauty for deeper truth?" The literary and historical references were delivered with casual authority that left Richard speechless. These weren't surface-level facts that could be memorized from program notes. They represented deep scholarly understanding of the piece's cultural origins. "Or perhaps," Amara continued, "you're referring to the structural sophistication? The way Chopin uses the ballad form to create a musical narrative that follows classical dramatic principles? The exposition of themes, the development through variation and conflict, the recapitulation that transforms the original material through the lens of experience." Dr. Reed was nodding appreciatively. These were graduate-level insights, the kind of analytical understanding that typically came only through years of formal study. But Amara was delivering them with the confidence of someone who had internalized the knowledge through personal exploration. As for cultural significance, Amara said, her voice gaining strength, perhaps you could explain why this piece has resonated with audiences for over 150 years, why it continues to challenge and inspire performers, why it's considered one of the greatest achievements in Romantic piano literature. The questions were devastating because they revealed the hollowness of Richard's own understanding. He had always approached the ballade as a technical challenge, a showcase for his abilities. But Amara's interpretation had demonstrated that the piece was something far more profound, a meditation on loss, love, and the search for meaning in a world that often seemed hostile to beauty. "I think," Richard said, his voice now edged with desperation, "that we need to remember the difference between studying music and understanding it, between memorizing information and developing wisdom, between playing notes and creating art." The irony of his words was lost on no one. He was accusing Amara of the very limitations that her performance had revealed in his own approach to music. "You're absolutely right," Amara said, standing and stepping away from the piano. "There is a difference. Would you like to demonstrate it?" The challenge was clear. Richard could either perform the same piece and invite direct comparison, or he could retreat and acknowledge that his planned performance would be inadequate after what the audience had just experienced. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Richard grappled with his options. Every choice seemed to lead to further humiliation. But his pride, his ego, his entire sense of self-worth was bound up in his identity as a superior musician. He couldn't walk away. "Very well," he said, approaching the piano with visible reluctance. "Perhaps it's time for you to hear how this piece sounds when it's performed by someone with proper training and professional experience." But as Richard sat down at the piano bench, everyone in that room realized they were about to witness something unprecedented, a direct musical confrontation between raw genius and hollow sophistication, between authentic emotion and practiced technique, between someone who had lived the music and someone who had merely learned it. Richard Pemberton approached the Steinway grand piano with the kind of theatrical confidence that had served him well in concert halls around the world. But tonight, in front of an audience that had just witnessed true musical genius, his practiced stage presence felt hollow and desperate. He adjusted the bench height with exaggerated precision, tested the key response with a few scales, and flexed his fingers in the elaborate warm-up routine that had become his trademark. The performance was designed to remind the audience of his professional credentials, but instead, it highlighted the contrast between his need for external validation and Amara's quiet self-assurance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying the practiced charm that had made him a favorite at charity galas, "I'd like to demonstrate how this magnificent piece sounds when it's interpreted by someone with formal training and professional experience." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. He was positioning himself as the authority, the standard against which Amara's performance should be measured. But the audience had already heard perfection, and they were about to witness how inferior technique sounded when compared to genuine artistry. Richard began the opening of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 with mechanical precision. Every note was technically correct, every phrase properly shaped according to conventional interpretation. But something crucial was missing, the emotional authenticity that had made Amara's performance transcendent. Jonathan Reed winced as Richard played the opening theme. The tempo was slightly too fast, the phrasing too rigid, the emotional content too calculated. It was the kind of performance that would earn good reviews from critics who valued technical proficiency over artistic truth, but it paled in comparison to what they had just heard. "He's playing the notes, Doctor," Reed whispered to Elizabeth Whitmore, "but he's not telling the story." The comparison was inevitable and devastating. Where Amara had found narrative flow and emotional logic in every phrase, Richard's interpretation felt fragmented, as if he were demonstrating technical exercises rather than communicating a unified artistic vision. Grace Johnson watched from the back row with a mixture of pride and sadness. She had spent years listening to Amara practice, had witnessed the gradual transformation of raw talent into refined artistry, but she had also seen the cost, the countless hours of solitary practice, the social isolation, the relentless drive toward perfection that had consumed her niece's adolescence. As Richard moved into the piece's first development section, his limitations became increasingly apparent. The rapid passages that had flowed like water under Amara's fingers sounded labored and mechanical. The complex polyrhythms that she had navigated with effortless grace challenged his coordination and exposed the gaps in his preparation. Caroline Mitchell felt a growing sense of panic. The evening was supposed to showcase Richard's artistry and raise money for the Foundation's music education programs. Instead, it was becoming a public demonstration of his inadequacy. She could see patrons exchanging glances, could sense the shifting mood in the room. "This is embarrassing," Elizabeth Whitmore murmured, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by nearby patrons. "After what we just witnessed, this sounds like a student recital." The comment stung because it was accurate. Richard's performance, while technically competent, lacked the depth and sophistication that the audience now expected. They had been spoiled by Amara's interpretation, had experienced what it meant to hear music, performed with complete understanding and emotional honesty. But the real disaster came when Richard reached the piece's famous middle section, the area where Amara had demonstrated such extraordinary mastery. The rapid arpeggios that had sparkled under her touch sounded clumsy and forced. The harmonic progressions that had told a story of seduction and danger fell flat, reduced to mere technical display. "He's struggling, Doctor," Reed observed, his professional ear detecting the slight hesitations and corrective adjustments that revealed Richard's discomfort. "He's not prepared for this level of scrutiny." The audience was restless now, their attention wandering as Richard's performance continued to disappoint. These were sophisticated listeners who had heard the piece performed by world-class artists. They could recognize the difference between competent technique and inspired artistry. As Richard approached the climactic section, his nervousness became increasingly evident. The fortissimo passage that had emerged from Amara's hands with such power and conviction sounded forced and artificial. The emotional intensity that should have built throughout the piece was absent, replaced by empty technical display. "He's not feeling it," Grace Johnson thought, watching Richard's face contort with effort. "He's just going through the motions." The contrast with Amara's performance was devastating. Where she had found emotional truth in every phrase, Richard was simply executing a predetermined interpretation. Where she had connected with the music's narrative structure, he was demonstrating his ability to play difficult passages. When Richard finally reached the piece's conclusion, the audience's relief was palpable. The performance had been technically adequate, but emotionally empty, a textbook demonstration of how not to interpret one of the great masterpieces of the piano repertoire. The applause that followed was polite but perfunctory, the kind reserved for performances that meet minimum standards without inspiring genuine appreciation. The contrast with the thunderous ovation that had greeted Amara's performance was stark and unmistakable. Richard rose from the piano bench with visible relief, his face flushed with embarrassment and suppressed anger. He had intended to demonstrate his superiority, but instead had revealed the limitations that serious critics had always suspected but rarely articulated. "Thank you," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I hope that clarifies the difference between professional interpretation and amateur enthusiasm." But even as he spoke, everyone in the room knew that the only thing that had been clarified was the difference between someone who had studied music and someone who had become music, between technical competence and artistic genius, between performing notes and creating meaning. And as Richard stepped away from the piano, the awkward silence that followed made one thing devastatingly clear. In trying to prove his superiority, he had instead demonstrated that all his training, all his credentials, all his professional experience meant nothing compared to the raw authenticity of someone who had found their soul in music. The silence that followed Richard's performance was more damaging than any criticism could have been. It was the silence of an audience that had just witnessed the Emperor's new clothes, the uncomfortable quiet that settles over a room when shared illusions are shattered. Dr. Jonathan Reed was the first to break the spell, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 3 decades identifying and nurturing musical talent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, rising from his chair, "I think we've just witnessed something unprecedented in Chicago's musical history." Richard felt his stomach drop. He had expected Dr. Reed to provide diplomatic commentary, perhaps even gentle criticism of Amara's unconventional approach. Instead, the conductor was positioning himself as a witness to something extraordinary. In my 30 years with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, Dr. Reed continued, I have had the privilege of working with some of the world's greatest musicians. I have heard this piece performed by international soloists, by conservatory graduates, by artists who have devoted their entire lives to mastering the piano repertoire. The praise was building towards something, and Richard could sense the direction it was taking. He tried to interject, but Dr. Reed's momentum was unstoppable. But I have never heard the ballade No. One interpreted with such complete understanding of its emotional architecture, such profound connection to its narrative structure, such authentic expression of its deepest truths. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Doctor. Reed wasn't just praising Amara's performance. He was declaring it superior to anything he had experienced in his distinguished career. Elizabeth Whitmore, who had initially been skeptical of Amara's presence at the gala, found herself nodding in agreement. It was extraordinary, she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had been genuinely moved. I've attended hundreds of classical performances, but I've never heard anything like that. The endorsement from Chicago's cultural elite was devastating for Richard. These were the people whose opinions shaped the city's musical landscape, whose support determined which artists received funding and recognition. Their unanimous praise for Amara's performance was professional suicide for someone who had built his career on being the acknowledged master. With all due respect, Richard said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger, I think we need to maintain some perspective here. Technical proficiency and emotional manipulation are not the same thing as mature musical interpretation. The comment revealed the depth of his desperation. He was dismissing one of the most profound musical experiences the audience had ever witnessed as emotional manipulation, revealing more about his own limitations than Amara's abilities. Emotional manipulation? Doctor, Reed repeated, his tone incredulous. Mr. Pemberton, that young woman just demonstrated a level of musical understanding that most professionals never achieve. She didn't manipulate our emotions. She revealed truths that were already present in the music. The rebuke was public and humiliating. Doctor. Reed, one of the most respected musical authorities in the city, was essentially calling Richard's judgment into question. The other patrons were listening intently, their opinions being shaped by every word. Caroline Mitchell, watching her carefully planned evening disintegrate, made a desperate attempt to regain control. Perhaps we should return to the scheduled program, she suggested, her voice tight with anxiety. Mr. Pemberton has prepared a lovely selection of Chopin etudes. Actually, Amara interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, I'd like to address something that Mr. Pemberton said, about emotional manipulation versus mature interpretation. The room fell silent again. Amara had been quietly listening to the exchange, but now she was inserting herself back into the conversation with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Mr. Pemberton, she said, turning toward his voice, you keep using the word professional as if it means something, but what does it really mean? Does it mean someone who has studied at prestigious institutions? Someone who has performed in famous concert halls? Someone who has received critical acclaim? The questions were delivered with such calm authority that they felt like philosophical inquiries rather than personal attacks. But Richard could sense the trap being constructed around him. Or does it mean someone who has mastered their craft? Someone who can connect with audiences on a deep emotional level? Someone who can reveal new truths in familiar music? The distinction was devastating because it highlighted the difference between credentials and competence, between reputation and reality. Richard had spent his career accumulating the external markers of success while neglecting the internal development that created true artistry. The thing is, Amara continued, I've been studying your recordings for years. I've analyzed your interpretations, your technical approach, your artistic choices, and I've always wondered why someone with such impressive credentials could produce music that felt so empty. The word empty hit the room like a physical blow. It was the criticism that had haunted Richard throughout his career, the suggestion that his playing, while technically proficient, lacked the emotional authenticity that separated good pianists from great ones. Tonight, I finally understood, Amara said, her voice gaining strength. You play music as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a story to be told. You approach each piece as a technical challenge rather than an emotional journey. You perform for audiences rather than communicating with them. The analysis was surgical in its precision, cutting through years of professional pretense to reveal the fundamental emptiness at the core of Richard's artistry. Several patrons were nodding in recognition, finally understanding why his performances had always left them feeling vaguely unsatisfied. But the most tragic thing, Amara continued, is that you've spent so much time building your reputation that you've forgotten why music exists in the first place. It's not about impressing people with your technique. It's not about demonstrating your superior education. It's about connecting human hearts to something beautiful and true. The room was completely silent now, every person absorbed in what was essentially a masterclass in musical philosophy, delivered by a 16-year-old girl who had never set foot in a conservatory. So when you talk about professional interpretation, Amara concluded, I have to ask, professional according to whom? According to critics who value technical display over emotional honesty? According to institutions that prioritize credentials over creativity? According to audiences who mistake complexity for profundity? And as her words echoed through the Steinway Cultural Hall, everyone realized they were witnessing more than just a musical confrontation. They were seeing the complete intellectual and artistic dismantling of a man who had confused success with significance, reputation with reality, and performance with truth. The silence that followed Amara's devastating critique stretched across the Steinway Cultural Hall like a held breath. 200 of Chicago's most influential citizens sat transfixed, not just by the girl's musical genius, but by her ability to articulate truths about art and authenticity that most of them had never considered. Richard Pemberton stood frozen beside the piano, his face cycling through expressions of rage, humiliation, and dawning comprehension. For the first time in his career, someone had looked past his credentials, his reputation, his carefully constructed image, and seen the artistic emptiness beneath. You don't understand, he said, his voice breaking with desperation. You can't just dismiss everything I've worked for. I've spent decades studying with the world's greatest teachers. I've performed in the most prestigious venues. I've earned the respect of critics and audiences worldwide. The defense was pathetic because it relied entirely on external validation rather than internal truth. Amara had just demonstrated that all the credentials in the world meant nothing compared to genuine musical understanding. I'm not dismissing your achievements, Amara replied, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had found peace with difficult truths. I'm questioning what they actually mean. You've accumulated impressive credentials, but have you developed as an artist? You've performed in famous halls, but have you connected with audiences? You've earned critical acclaim, but have you created something meaningful? The questions were devastating because they exposed the hollowness of Richard's entire career. He had spent 30 years building a reputation based on technical proficiency and social connections, but had never developed the emotional depth that transforms competent performance into transcendent art. To be Jonathan Reed, watching the exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a historical moment, realized that he was observing more than just a musical confrontation. This was a philosophical debate about the nature of artistic excellence, delivered by two people who represented fundamentally different approaches to their craft. This girl, he whispered to Elizabeth Whitmore, she's not just a musician, she's a teacher. She's showing us what we've been missing. Elizabeth nodded, her own understanding of musical excellence being reshaped by Amara's words. She had spent years attending concerts, funding musical education, supporting artists like Richard because she believed their credentials guaranteed their worth. But now she was beginning to question whether she had been investing in the right things. Mr. Pemberton, Amara continued, you asked me about historical context, about structural sophistication, about cultural significance. But you never asked me about the most important thing, why this music matters, why it has the power to move people, to change them, to reveal truths about the human experience that words alone cannot express. The observation was profound because it highlighted the difference between academic knowledge and artistic wisdom. Richard had mastered the technical aspects of his craft, but had never grasped its deeper purpose. I learned this piece, Amara said, her voice taking on the quality of someone sharing a sacred truth, not from a teacher or a textbook, but from grief, Every note represents something I lost in that car accident 8 years ago. Every phrase tells the story of how I rebuilt my understanding of beauty after losing my sight. Every dynamic marking reflects the emotional journey from despair to acceptance to joy. The room was completely silent now, every person absorbed in what was essentially a testimony about the transformative power of art. Amara wasn't just explaining her interpretation, she was revealing how music had literally saved her life. When I play this piece, she continued, I'm not demonstrating my technical skills or showing off my musical education. I'm sharing the most important story I know, the story of how someone can lose everything and still find reasons to create beauty. Grace Johnson, listening from the back row, felt tears streaming down her face. She had witnessed Amara's journey from the angry, broken 8-year-old who had awakened in a hospital bed to the poised, confident young woman who was now holding Chicago's cultural elite spellbound with her wisdom. That's what music is supposed to do, Amara said, her voice gaining strength. It's supposed to transform suffering into beauty, isolation into connection, despair into hope. It's supposed to remind us that even in our darkest moments, we have the capacity to create something meaningful. The philosophy was simple but profound, the kind of truth that could only come from someone who had tested it against the hardest realities of human experience. Richard had spent his career treating music as a performance medium, but Amara had discovered it as a survival tool. So when you talk about professional interpretation, Amara concluded, I have to ask professional according to what standard? According to the ability to impress critics? According to the capacity to earn applause? According to the skill to demonstrate technical mastery? The questions hung in the air like a challenge, but Richard had no answer. His entire understanding of musical excellence had been constructed around external validation, around the opinions of others, around the accumulation of credentials and accolades. Or, Amara continued, should we judge musical interpretation by its ability to reveal truth, by its capacity to connect with human hearts, by its power to transform both performer and audience? The alternative standard was revolutionary because it placed the emphasis on internal development rather than external recognition, on artistic growth rather than career advancement, on spiritual connection rather than social status. I think, Dr. Reed said, his voice carrying the authority of someone making a momentous decision, that we need to reconsider how we define musical excellence. This young woman has demonstrated something that formal education alone cannot teach, the ability to transform personal experience into universal art. The endorsement was career-changing for Amara and career-ending for Richard. Dr. Reed's opinion carried weight in conservatories and concert halls worldwide. His recognition of Amara's genius would open doors that had been closed to her by circumstance and prejudice. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Reed continued, addressing the entire audience, I would like to make an announcement. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra has a program for identifying and nurturing exceptional young talent. I am personally recommending that Miss Johnson be offered a full scholarship to study with our organization. The offer was unprecedented. The Chicago Symphony's youth program was one of the most prestigious in the country, typically reserved for graduates of elite conservatories. To offer it to a self-taught 16-year-old from the South Side was revolutionary. But even as the audience erupted in applause, Richard Pemberton realized that his own world was collapsing. The cultural elite who had once celebrated his artistry were now witnessing his complete professional humiliation. His reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, was being destroyed by a blind girl who had found more truth in music than he had ever imagined possible. And as the applause thundered through the hall, everyone realized they were witnessing more than just the recognition of exceptional talent. They were seeing the complete transformation of how Chicago's cultural community understood the true meaning of musical mastery. If you believe that true talent should be recognized regardless of someone's background, circumstances, or the prejudices they face, type respect below. Let's show that authentic artistry will always triumph over empty credentials. The standing ovation that followed Dr. Reed's announcement seemed to last forever, but eventually reality began to settle over the Steinway Cultural Hall. The evening that had begun as a showcase for Richard Pemberton's artistry had transformed into something unprecedented. the public recognition of genius in its most unexpected form. Caroline Mitchell, the Foundation's director, found herself in an impossible position. The event was supposed to raise $2, $3 million for music education programs, but the scheduled performer had been completely overshadowed by an uninvited guest. Her carefully planned program was in ruins, but she couldn't deny what everyone had witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, taking the microphone with trembling hands, "I think we can all agree that tonight has been extraordinary. Miss Johnson, we are honored by your presence and humbled by your talent." The words were gracious, but they couldn't disguise the fact that the evening had spiraled completely out of her control. Richard Pemberton, who was supposed to be the star attraction, stood at the side of the stage looking lost and defeated. Elizabeth Whitmore, who had initially questioned Amara's right to be at the gala, now approached the stage with the determination of someone who had experienced a genuine conversion. "Miss Johnson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you based on appearances, and I was completely wrong." The public acknowledgement was significant because it came from one of Chicago's most influential cultural patrons. Elizabeth's opinion shaped funding decisions and institutional policies throughout the city. Her recognition of Amara's talent would have far-reaching implications. "I would like to personally fund your musical education," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Whatever you need, instruments, instruction, opportunities, I want to ensure that your extraordinary gift is properly nurtured." The offer was generous, but it also revealed how little the cultural elite understood about Amara's true needs. She didn't lack talent or dedication. She lacked access to the networks and opportunities that privilege typically provided. "That's very kind," Amara replied, her voice carrying the diplomatic grace of someone who had learned to navigate condescension with dignity. "But I think there's something more important than individual support. There are dozens of young musicians in Chicago who have the same potential I do, but they'll never get the chance to demonstrate it because they don't have access to venues like this." The observation was profound because it shifted the focus from individual charity to systemic change. Amara wasn't just asking for personal opportunities. She was challenging the structure that had nearly prevented her own talent from being recognized. "What if," she continued, "instead of just funding my education, we created opportunities for other young musicians who have been overlooked? What if we changed how we identify and nurture talent in this city?" The suggestion was revolutionary. The Chicago cultural establishment had always operated on the assumption that talent would naturally rise to the surface through existing channels, prestigious schools, formal competitions, established networks. But Amara's presence proved that extraordinary abilities could develop in unexpected places. Dr. Reed, who had been listening intently, stepped forward with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a new mission. "Miss Johnson is absolutely right," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Our current system is failing to identify and develop the full range of musical talent in Chicago. We need to create new pathways, new opportunities, new ways of recognizing excellence." The moment was transformative because it represented more than just individual recognition. It was the beginning of institutional change. The people in that room controlled Chicago's cultural budget, its educational policies, its artistic priorities. Their commitment to reform could reshape the city's musical landscape. But even as the evening took on the character of a social justice movement, Richard Pemberton remained frozen at the side of the stage, watching his professional world collapse in real time. Every word of praise for Amara's revolutionary approach was an implicit criticism of his own conventional path. "I think," he said, his voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere, "that we're getting a bit carried away here. This has been a lovely evening, but let's not forget that musical excellence requires proper training, systematic development, and professional guidance." The comment was tone-deaf because it revealed his complete failure to understand what had just happened. He was defending an educational system that had produced technically competent but emotionally empty performers, while dismissing the self-directed learning that had created genuine artistry. "Mr. Pemberton, Doctor," Reed said, his voice carrying a note of disappointment, "I think tonight has demonstrated that our assumptions about musical training need to be reconsidered. This young woman has achieved something that formal education alone cannot teach, the ability to transform personal experience into universal art. The rebuke was public and final. Dr. Reed was essentially saying that Richard's entire approach to music was fundamentally flawed, that his years of formal training had produced inferior results compared to Amara's intuitive development. Furthermore, Dr. Reed continued, I think we need to examine our own biases about who can be an artist and how artistic excellence develops. Miss Johnson has shown us that talent doesn't respect our conventional boundaries or our institutional prejudices. The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was clear. The cultural establishment had failed to recognize Amara's genius because of assumptions about race, class, disability, and educational background. Their oversight was a moral failing as much as an artistic one. Grace Johnson, watching from the back row, felt a mixture of pride and concern. She was thrilled by the recognition her niece was receiving, but she also understood the pressures that would come with sudden fame. Amara had spent 8 years developing her artistry in private. Now she would have to maintain it under public scrutiny. The question, Amara said, her voice cutting through the growing excitement, is whether we're really committed to change or just interested in feeling good about ourselves. Are we going to create genuine opportunities for overlooked talent, or are we going to make token gestures and then go back to business as usual? The challenge was direct and uncomfortable. Amara was essentially asking the cultural elite to prove their commitment to reform through actions rather than words, to demonstrate that their recognition of her talent would translate into systemic change. I propose, Dr. Reed said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone making a historic commitment, that we establish a new program specifically designed to identify and nurture musical talent in Chicago's underserved communities. We'll call it the Johnson Initiative, and we'll fund it with the proceeds from tonight's event. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, but Amara's expression suggested she understood the challenges ahead. Creating institutional change was far more difficult than delivering a single extraordinary performance. But as the evening moved toward its conclusion, everyone realized that what they had witnessed was just the beginning, the first movement in a symphony of change that would either transform Chicago's musical landscape or reveal the true depth of its resistance to genuine reform. These stories of courage and talent breaking through prejudice inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages of artistic excellence and social justice are reaching. 6 months after the evening that changed everything, the Chicago music scene was unrecognizable. The Johnson Initiative, funded by an unprecedented $3.2 million raised at the gala, had identified and begun nurturing 47 young musicians from across the city's most underserved communities. Amara Johnson, now 17, walked through the halls of the Chicago Music Academy not as the janitor's niece seeking borrowed practice time, but as the Academy's youngest artist in residence. The title came with a full scholarship, private instruction from the city's most distinguished teachers, and, most importantly, the authority to shape the institution's approach to talent development. The transformation has been remarkable, Dr. Jonathan Reed told the Chicago Tribune in an interview that would be republished in music journals worldwide. Miss Johnson hasn't just changed how we identify talent, she's revolutionized how we understand the relationship between personal experience and artistic excellence. The Academy's practice rooms, once dominated by students from wealthy suburban families, now echoed with the sounds of young musicians from across Chicago's economic spectrum. The selection process had been completely redesigned, emphasizing musical understanding and emotional authenticity over technical perfection and formal training. We learned that we had been looking in all the wrong places, Caroline Mitchell explained to the Foundation's board of directors. We were so focused on credentials and conventional pathways that we were missing extraordinary talent, developing in unexpected circumstances. The Foundation's music education programs had been expanded to include community partnerships, mentorship initiatives, and performance opportunities specifically designed for students who had been overlooked by traditional systems. The results were already evident in the quality and diversity of young musicians emerging from Chicago's neighborhoods, but the most significant change was in the city's cultural consciousness. The story of Amara's triumph had become a touchstone for discussions about talent, opportunity, and the responsibility of institutions to recognize excellence wherever it emerged. She didn't just perform beautifully, Elizabeth Whitmore reflected during a fundraising dinner for the Johnson Initiative. She challenged us to examine our own assumptions about who could be an artist and how artistic excellence develops. She forced us to confront the ways our biases had limited our ability to recognize genuine talent. The wealthy patrons who had once dismissed Amara as an inconvenient disruption now competed to support programs that would identify and nurture similar talents. The gala that had raised $3 million for conventional music education had generated over $8 million in ongoing commitments to the reformed system. Meanwhile, Richard Pemberton's career had taken a very different trajectory. The video of his confrontation with Amara had gone viral, generating millions of views and countless analyses of what critics called the most devastating artistic critique ever delivered in public. Pemberton's fall from grace had become a case study in music schools worldwide, used to illustrate the difference between technical competence and artistic authenticity. His scheduled performances were cancelled one by one, as venues realized that audiences now expected the kind of emotional depth he had never developed. "It's tragic," Dr. Reed commented in a private interview. He was a competent musician who built his career on the assumption that credentials and connections were enough. But Amara showed us what real artistry looks like, and suddenly his approach seemed hollow and outdated. Richard had retreated to a small apartment in Milwaukee, where he gave private lessons to teenage students and tried to rebuild his understanding of music from the ground up. The process was humbling and painful, but it was also his only path toward genuine artistic development. "I spent 30 years treating music as a performance medium," he confessed to a former colleague. "I never understood that it was supposed to be a communication tool, a way of sharing truth and beauty with other human beings. That girl taught me something I should have learned decades ago." The transformation in Chicago's music scene was being studied by cultural institutions worldwide. The Johnson Initiative had become a model for inclusive talent development, proving that artistic excellence could emerge from unexpected places when given proper support and recognition. "The old system was designed to reproduce itself," Amara explained to a gathering of music educators from across the country. "It selected students who already had advantages and then provided them with more advantages. But real talent doesn't respect those boundaries. It develops wherever someone has the passion and dedication to pursue it." Her philosophy had begun to influence institutions far beyond Chicago. Conservatories were redesigning their admission processes, orchestras were expanding their outreach programs, and funding organizations were reconsidering how they defined artistic merit. "Miss Johnson has reminded us that music is a universal language," Dr. Reed told the assembled educators. "But we had been teaching it as if it were a private dialect, accessible only to those who had the right background and the right connections. She's shown us how to make it truly universal again." The success of the Johnson Initiative had created a new generation of young musicians who approached their art with the same combination of technical excellence and emotional authenticity that had made Amara's performance so transformative. "These kids aren't just learning to play their instruments," Grace Johnson observed, watching her niece work with a group of 12-year-olds from the West Side. "They're learning to use music as a way of processing their experiences, of communicating their truths, of connecting with other people." The change was visible in the quality of performances emerging from Chicago's music programs. Young musicians were playing with a depth and sincerity that had been missing from the city's cultural scene for decades. "It's not just about technique anymore," one of Amara's students explained to a documentary crew filming the initiative's progress. "It's about finding your own voice, your own story, your own way of connecting with the music." Miss Johnson taught us that authenticity is more important than perfection. The philosophy was spreading beyond music into other arts disciplines. Visual arts programs were emphasizing personal expression over technical reproduction. Theater groups were prioritizing emotional truth over polished performance. The entire cultural ecosystem was being transformed by the recognition that authentic artistry could emerge from any background. "Amara Johnson didn't just change how we identify musical talent," Elizabeth Whitmore concluded in her address to the National Arts Foundation. She changed how we understand the relationship between art and life, between privilege and excellence, between formal training and genuine creativity. But as Chicago's music scene continued to evolve, the most profound transformation was still taking place in the life of the young woman who had started it all, because Amara Johnson was about to discover that changing the world was only the beginning of her journey. 2 years after the night that changed everything, Amara Johnson stood on the stage of Symphony Center Chicago, preparing to perform the world premiere of her own composition, a piece that would complete her transformation from overlooked prodigy to internationally recognized artist. The audience of 2,500 included music critics from around the world, conservatory directors, and cultural leaders who had come to witness what the New York Times called the most significant development in classical music of the past decade. But it also included 47 young musicians from Chicago's underserved communities, students in the Johnson Initiative, who represented the continuing impact of that transformative evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Jonathan Reed announced, his voice carrying the weight of history. "Tonight we celebrate not just the artistic achievement of an extraordinary young woman, but the transformation of an entire cultural community. Miss Johnson has shown us that excellence has no barriers, that genius can emerge from any circumstance, and that true artistry comes from the courage to transform personal experience into universal truth." The composition Amara was about to perform, Variations on Loss and Recovery, had been commissioned by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra specifically to commemorate the changes she had brought to the city's musical landscape. But it was also deeply personal, a musical autobiography that traced her journey from the devastation of losing her parents and her sight to the triumph of finding her voice as an artist. "This piece," Amara explained to the audience, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own artistic vision, "is about the power of music to transform suffering into beauty, isolation into connection, despair into hope. It's about what happens when we refuse to accept other people's limitations and instead choose to discover our own possibilities." The philosophy that had emerged from her confrontation with Richard Pemberton had become the foundation of a new approach to artistic education. The Johnson Initiative, now in its second year, had identified and nurtured over 200 young musicians, many of whom had gone on to prestigious conservatories and professional orchestras around the world. As Amara placed her hands on the piano keys, the hall fell into the kind of reverential silence that had become her trademark. The composition she was about to perform represented more than personal artistic achievement. It was a testament to the power of authentic expression to transform both individual lives and entire communities. The opening notes of Variations on Loss and Recovery emerged with the emotional honesty that had made her famous. The theme, based on a melody she had composed during her darkest period after the accident, spoke of grief so profound, it seemed to reshape the very structure of reality. Grace Johnson, sitting in the front row, recognized the musical fragments from those early years when Amara had used the piano to process emotions too complex for words. The melody that was now being celebrated as groundbreaking composition had once been the desperate attempt of a broken child to find meaning in chaos. The first variation, Amara had explained during rehearsals, represents the anger phase, the refusal to accept loss, the rage against circumstances beyond our control. It's the music of someone who hasn't yet learned that fighting against reality is less productive than working with it. The variation exploded from the piano with controlled fury, each note a small act of rebellion against the unfairness of existence. The technical demands were extraordinary, but the emotional content was what made the music transcendent. This wasn't anger for its own sake, it was anger in service of something larger. In the audience, Richard Pemberton sat quietly in the back section, his presence a reminder of how completely the musical landscape had changed. The man who had once dismissed Amara as an enthusiastic amateur was now one of her most dedicated students, having spent the past 2 years rebuilding his understanding of music from the ground up. "She saved my career," he had told a journalist from Classical Music magazine. "Not by forgiving me, but by showing me what I had been missing. I spent 30 years playing music without understanding what it was for. She taught me that technique without truth is just noise." The second variation shifted into a more contemplative mode, representing the gradual acceptance of loss and the slow recognition that suffering could be transformed into something beautiful. The music spoke of the daily work of rebuilding, not just learning to navigate the world without sight, but discovering new ways to experience beauty and meaning. This is where the real growth happens, Amara had explained, not in the dramatic moments of breakthrough, but in the patient, daily work of transforming pain into purpose. It's the least glamorous part of the process, but it's also the most important. The variation unfolded with the patience of someone who had learned that healing couldn't be rushed, that genuine transformation required time and dedication. The melody line moved through complex harmonies that represented the slow work of building new foundations on the ruins of old certainties. Dr. Reed, listening from the orchestra pit, marveled at the maturity of the composition. At 19, Amara had created a work that rivaled the great masterpieces of the repertoire in its emotional depth and structural sophistication. But more than that, she had created something entirely new, a musical language that spoke directly to the experience of overcoming adversity. The third variation, the program notes explained, represents the discovery of joy, not the simple happiness of forgetting pain, but the complex joy of someone who has learned to find beauty in a broken world. This section of the composition was perhaps the most revolutionary, because it avoided the false choice between tragic suffering and shallow optimism. Instead, it found a third path, the recognition that joy and sorrow could coexist, that healing didn't require forgetting, that strength could emerge from acknowledged vulnerability. The music danced between major and minor keys, between moments of lightness and passages of reflection, creating a sonic landscape that felt both celebratory and profoundly wise. It was the sound of someone who had learned to embrace the full spectrum of human experience. Elizabeth Whitmore, who had become one of the Johnson Initiative's most dedicated supporters, found herself crying as she listened to the variation. The music was telling her own story, the story of a woman who had discovered that her wealth and privilege meant nothing compared to the authentic connections she had formed through supporting genuinely transformative art. The final variation, Amara had explained, isn't about individual recovery. It's about what happens when personal transformation becomes a catalyst for community change. It's about the responsibility that comes with finding your voice, the obligation to use it in service of something larger than yourself. The concluding section of the composition incorporated musical themes from the Johnson Initiative's young musicians, weaving their individual voices into a complex tapestry that represented the collective impact of inclusive artistic education. The music spoke of a community that had learned to value authenticity over credentials, depth over surface polish, truth over convention. As the composition built toward its climax, the emotional intensity in the hall was palpable. This wasn't just a performance, it was a summation of everything that had changed in Chicago's musical landscape over the past 2 years. The music embodied the transformation from exclusion to inclusion, from prejudice to recognition, from hollow technique to authentic artistry. The final chord resonated through Symphony Center Chicago with the kind of finality that suggested not an ending but a beginning. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that emerges when an audience realizes they have witnessed something historically significant. Then, slowly, the ovation began. It started with Dr. Reed, who rose from his seat with tears streaming down his face. Elizabeth Whitmore followed, then Grace Johnson, then the young musicians from the Johnson Initiative. Within moments, the entire audience was on its feet, applauding with the kind of intensity reserved for performances that change lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Reed said, taking the microphone as the applause finally subsided, "what we have witnessed tonight is more than a musical performance. It's a testament to the power of art, to transform not just individual lives but entire communities. Miss Johnson has shown us that excellence has no barriers, that genius can emerge from any circumstance, and that authentic artistry comes from the courage to transform personal experience into universal truth." But even as the celebration continued around her, Amara remained focused on the future. The Johnson Initiative had proven that inclusive artistic education could work, but there were still thousands of young musicians across the country who lacked access to the opportunities they deserved. "This is just the beginning," she told the assembled crowd. "What we've accomplished in Chicago proves that talent exists everywhere. in every neighborhood, every community, every circumstance. Our responsibility now is to create systems that can recognize and nurture that talent wherever it emerges. The commitment was ambitious, but the success of the Johnson Initiative had demonstrated that transformation was possible. Music conservatories across the country were redesigning their programs, orchestras were expanding their outreach efforts, and funding organizations were reconsidering how they defined artistic merit. The old system told us that excellence was rare and required special circumstances to develop, Amara continued. But we've learned that excellence is actually common. It's opportunity that's rare. Our job is to change that equation. As the evening concluded and the audience began to disperse, the impact of what had been accomplished was clear. The blind girl, who had been dismissed as an inconvenient disruption, had become a catalyst for the most significant transformation in classical music education in decades. She didn't just change how we identify talent, Caroline Mitchell reflected, as she watched Amara surrounded by young musicians from the initiative. She changed how we understand the relationship between art and life, between privilege and excellence, between formal training and genuine creativity. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing. Every day, young musicians in Chicago and beyond were discovering that their backgrounds didn't limit their potential, that their experiences could become the foundation for extraordinary artistry, that their voices mattered in the great conversation of human culture. Music doesn't belong to any of us, Amara had said that transformative night 2 years earlier. It exists to connect human hearts regardless of our background or appearance. That is the true democracy of art. The words had become a rallying cry for a new generation of musicians who understood that their art was not just about personal achievement, but about community transformation, not just about individual excellence, but about collective uplift, not just about performing music, but about changing the world. And in the end, that was Amara Johnson's greatest composition, not the piece she had performed that night, but the movement she had created, the lives she had transformed, the future she had made possible for countless young artists who would never have to face the barriers that had once stood in her way. The blind prodigy's revenge was complete, but it wasn't about destroying her critics. It was about building a world where no one would ever again be dismissed for lacking the right credentials, the right connections, or the right circumstances. It was about proving that true artistry could emerge from anywhere, that genuine talent could overcome any obstacle, and that the most powerful force in the world was the courage to transform personal suffering into universal beauty. Thank you to everyone who typed respect, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the